giving money to the banks, giving money to the unconventional monetary policy, to the non-banking financial institutions, to microfinance institutions, and to mutual funds, so that they can lend directly to the consumers or the needy. And then there were lowering of the repo rate and further lowering of the reverse repo rate, so that the banks get incentivized to lend it to the people who deserve some hand-holding during this pandemic. Now, it needs to be said at this hour, at this point of my talk, is that the banks often are reluctant to lend it to the MSMEs or otherwise. Why? Because the banks would prefer to lend it to a large borrower, that means at least a medium sector enterprise, if not the large, because if you give small loans to a large number of people, the transaction cost of processing that loans and the chances of default, the banks perceive they are going to be larger, and that would lead to creation of NPAs by the banks. So as a result, often it has been advised to the Reserve Bank of India to monetize the large foreign exchange reserves, which will lead to a free flow or a flow of money into the economy. But I don't know that if your foreign exchange reserves get reduced, if the economy limps back to normalcy, the first demand that the economy would have petroleum demand. And it is in fact petroleum demand has been rising, and most of the petroleum that we consume today in the economy comes from the rest of the world. So that is not a viable product. Atmanirbhar Bharat package proposal tells us it's a mix of fiscal support and monetary support. It's expenditure on social safety net through Jan Dhan, expenditure on healthcare, those small stimulus for small informal, micro and small enterprises in the economy. And this is likely to enhance the inequality in the economy further. So my question is, will this deliver? Is this a panacea? Now, if you look at the PMI for manufacturing, the PMI for manufacturing as well as services had been low in April, May, and in June there has been a slightly reversal up. As these are perception-based index, so with unlocked down, there has been an improvement in expectations in the economy, but this falls far short of when we started the process of lockdown, even though there was a decline in the economy prior to that. So even if there are expectations for the economy to look up with unlocked down, with the Atmanirbhar Bharat package proposals, they really fall short of what they were or expectations, and no one knows when we'll be out of this pandemic situation, out of this large specter of unemployment, the rising poverty rates and rising inequality rates. This evidence of looking up in June, the government has dubbed it as green shoots. Are these green shoots? I don't know if you call them green shoots. They are green shoots, necessarily green shoots, and the government has gone at length on the macroeconomic update for June, which is just out by the Ministry of Finance. But there are some areas where the economy has started looking up, And looking at the financial stability report, looking at the financial stability report, the government, the Reserve Bank governor said there has to be major reforms. The economy has to look up from or leverage from the IT sector, the communication sector, the power sector growth, and long-term financial stability. And why you need a financial stability for the economy? Because this is essential for business, private sector, and consumer confidence. And you would see that all the reform proposals were targeted towards that, so that there is some bit of confidence that is instilled in the economy and the economy start reviving. So the government, what they did, they thought of the long term, thought of the private sector led growth in the economy, and has abstained from its own this thing. Now, this is quite unlikely. What the government should have done, and with this last word, I should stop. They have devoted an additional 40,000 crore for MNNREGA proposals, but is that sufficient? I don't think that is not sufficient, because at this point of time, it is the rural economy which will bring the entire economy back to rails, because the monsoons are as predicted, they are normal, and the sowing season, the progress of the sowing season shows that it's normal, and the predictions for output are absolutely, at this point of time, they're absolutely normal. So if you can increase man days of work in the rural area, in terms of rural asset creation, in terms of crop sowing, then the migrant workers who have come back to their origin, they can get some employment, and there can be some temporary respite. But what the government has neglected in the process, it has neglected the entire urban sector, where and in the urban sector you would largely have these micro, small and medium enterprises, which account for almost 80% of total employment in the economy. And this sector would actually be the panacea for employment rejuvenation, the migrant worker going back to their places of work in times to come. But there has been no proposal from the government whatsoever at this point. And there has to be a large-scale flagship program like the MNNREGA for the urban sector and urban renewal mission. Whatever urban renewal mission had been there, that has not disbursed enough money to this urban poor so that they can come out of the poverty. If that has been disbursed, then people would not have migrated back to their places of origin. So the immediate concern of the government should be to enhance or earmark more money, expenditure for the MNNREGA, and to parallelly start an urban flagship program parallel to that of the MNNREGA. And if that is started, at least and there is associated cash transfer. It is not cash transfer to the banking sector, to the financial sector, because the government is perhaps more concerned about the financial health of the economy and more concerned about it's overshooting the expenditure, flouting the FRBM Act. But in times of crisis, it can afford to do that. It can afford to overshoot the FRBM targets and actually give some respite, at least in the short run, if not over the medium term and the long terms, through urban renewal program in infrastructure investment. But in terms of other asset creation in the urban sector, that would give the economy and bring back the economy faster than what the government is moving now. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Professor Shoikat Sinha Roy, sir, for your excellent discussion. It is really a very enriching and knowledge-provoking session for all of us. I know all of you are excited to have an interactive session with Professor Shoikat Sinha Roy. However, we have reserved the interactive session for both the speakers at the end of our session. Now, I will call upon our next speaker, Dr. Shanto Sadhu. I would now request Dr. Suparna Nandi, Associate Professor in Economics, Vidyasagar Metropolitan College, to deliver a humble introduction of our honorable speaker, Dr. Shanto Sadhu. Just a reminder to the participants again, if you have any question during the presentation of Dr. Sadhu, please write in the chat box. And please mute your audio and turn off your video and do not share your screen. Please. Over to Dr. Suparna Pal. Madam, please.
Thank you, Professor Shoma Shaha. It is my honor I have been given the opportunity to introduce Dr. Shanto Sadhu. Dr. Sadhu is a senior research scientist in the International Program Department at NORC at the University of Chicago. Dr. Sadhu serves as an impact evaluation specialist on multiple projects areas across Africa and Asia in a variety of developmental policy interventions. He currently leads NORC's financial inclusion and labor-related evaluations in developing countries. Before joining NORC, Dr. Sadhu worked in two premier research institutions in India during 2010-2014. He was the head of policy and in-house research team at the Center for Microfinance at IFMR LEAD, one of the leading institutions in South Asia for undertaking experimental research on poverty. Later, during 2013-14, Dr. Sadhu worked in IFMR Finance Foundation, a research and advocacy institution well known for applied research on financial services and influential policy advocacy role in expanding financial services to the financially excluded population in India. Dr. Sadhu also served as the short-term consultant at the World Bank during 2013-14. His research papers have been published in different international journals, including Economic Development and Cultural Change, Enterprise Development and Microfinance Review, Journal of the Center for Microfinance Research, and World Bank Working Paper. Now, without further ado, I request Dr. Shanto Sadhu to enlighten us with his valuable speech on this emerging issue, COVID-19, on livelihood of smallholder farmers and their protection during future pandemic. Just a reminder to the participants, if you have any questions during the presentation, please write in the chat box and please mute your audio and turn off your camera. Dr. Sadhu, now the platform is yours. Over to Dr. Sadhu. Sir, please.
Thank you, Dr. Suparna Pal. Thank you, Dr. Shoma Shaha. And I start with a humble thank to the organizing institutions, the Vivekananda, the two colleges that have been organizing this event, and also specifically to my esteemed other speaker, Professor Shoikat Sinha Roy, as well as all the participants. It is my pleasure and honor to present in this session today, and I wanted to first touch upon a very quick note on why we are focusing, at least in understanding of the different issues around the economy. We know that most of the countries, as Dr. Shoikat Sinha Roy has already provided a very brief and complete introduction of the issue problem India faced, as well as other countries. So essentially, different countries in the world have been facing this pandemic and the effects, facing different degrees of effect. and including human lives as well as loss of economic opportunity and income. And during this unprecedented time, most of the sectors have been affected in the economy to a different extent, including the agriculture, manufacturing, real estate, and service. And today, specifically in my talk, I'm going to talk about about the effect of COVID-19 on the Indian agricultural sector, specifically focusing on the effect on smallholder farmers, and who constitute more than 150 million smallholders in India, and within these 150 million smallholder families, they include almost 500 million population. So basically, it's a significant chunk of the rural economy, which provides employment to almost 70% of the rural population in India. And I think Dr. Soikatsinara has provided a very nice macro perspective and different issues at the macro level as well as the solutions. So this gives me an opportunity to very narrowly focus on a particular sector, the smallholders, who contribute to more than 50% of the population in India. Around 50% of the population in India. And most of the transactions in the smallholder farmer space is in the retail section, so which contributes around 70% of the retail sales. And some of the important facts that I think it is useful to understand why the smallholders are focus of my talk is across the globe, like the smallholder farmers typically from the Indian perspective, the smallholders are defined as the farmers with less than 2 hectares of cultivation or operational land. And this sector is across the world, not only in India, across the world, is the most exposed to any type of shock, mostly fragmented, and then basically they have very few or a very limited access to any coping mechanism. And in the Indian context, smallholders, like other countries as well, unfortunately highly unorganized. They have lack of access to technology. And as a result, there is a very low productivity, of these particular smallholders. They experience a lack of productivity compared to any other developed countries. And not only that, there are supply side constraints. For example, lack of access to formal market in terms of input markets, lack of access to the output markets, as well as the access to finance, all of which kind of prevents them to be, basically a very well-organized institution. And as a result of that, they have a very limited access to risk mitigation instrument, specifically insurance and other coping mechanism. So overall, this whole sector of smallholders, not only in India and in any other country, faces a huge, degree of uncertainty. And in the Indian subcontinent, and specifically in India, the smallholders as well as agricultural economy in the Indian perspective is largely dominated by middlemen. And I'll come back to this discussion why this is very important to understand the current scenario and trying to find a way forward to figure out what can be done to protect this particular group of smallholders from these negative shocks in future. So the first part of my talk I will focus discussing some, what has happened very briefly. And one point I wanted to stress here is that although we don't have very, robust data at this point, most of my discussion will be based on a particular survey that is available, some experience of the other countries. And at the same time, my discussions with the practitioners in the field who has real life experience. So I will use a mix of these, 3 separate sources. And unlike Professor Srinara's in a presentation, I don't have much data to show, but I'll just try to provide some reference whenever it is feasible, whenever their data exists. And The way I think I wanted to present it is to talk about an immediate effect on the smallholders, and then talk about a little bit about the effect at the short to medium term. And then finally, we talk about the way forward if we want to prevent these particular smallholders from facing this negative impact effect in the future. How our economy can be prepared, so that we cannot say that there will be no shock, but we can try to minimize the effect of such shock. So that's the way I would like to present my session today. So in terms of the immediate impact, it is I think very clear to all of us that the spread of COVID-19 in the Indian subcontinent, specifically in India, has severely affected most of the unorganized sector workers, and specifically the farmers. And they were like, when the shock actually started spreading, the COVID-19 started spreading in India, it was middle of their peak harvest season. So most of the farmers, based on the interaction as well as some of the limited survey data availability, it showed that the farmers had a negative effect on their harvest. And that is one of the main reasons behind that is lack of labor availability. The moment there was lockdown and announced in March, many of the farmers could not have completed their harvest, and it was still going, the harvest is still ongoing. And as a result of that, there was effect on their harvesting capacity. And then in the second part, the farmers are mostly dependent, the smallholder farmers are mostly dependent on the informal channels, the middlemen specifically. And the moment there was lockdown, then middlemen were no more active because they cannot operate. And at the same time, the other informal institutions, for example, the sabji mandis, were closed. So even if in some cases, some of the middlemen were active, there was no place to sell their product in the traditional manner that they use. To make things worse, most of the farmers do not have access to good storage facility, specifically for their fresh fruit and vegetables, perishable stuff. There is almost no access to long-term storage facilities. And as a result of that, most of the farmers who harvested their product were unable to sell their regular perishable fruits and vegetables. And some of the farmers were able to, store their, pulses and grains, but it was very difficult to store anything perishable. So most of the cases, there was a huge wastage, and there are a lot of incidents where media reported huge amount of wastage in the big mandis where farmers just dumped their product, or even they could not harvest, so they dumped on the ground itself. And then in that particular period, like after the first round of lockdown, the farmer producer organizations, which is a farmer cooperatives which are active, were desperately looking for market linkage because they had already collected good amount of product, but since the middlemen were not active because of the lockdown, the mandis were not open. They had a huge issue of selling their already accumulated perishable product. And in many cases, it got wasted. And so combinedly, given this lack of access to storage, lack of access to middlemen, lack of access to transportation facility, which broke down immediately after the lockdown was announced, because the farmers, number one, the drivers were not willing to, transport the product from one place to other. And then there were embargo on interstate transportation as well. So in both grounds, the transportation facilities got completely shut down. And combinedly, there is, although there is no strong data on that, but based on the experience from the ground, it is expected that during this period of mid-March to end May, when the peak period of the lockdown, it actually resulted approximately 50% loss of income for the farmers who are dependent on their sales to the market. So technically, this immediate impact was pretty severe on the small farmers because they were mostly unprotected. And there was a survey conducted during May 3rd to May 15th, supported by Harvard University's T.S. Chen School of Public Health Foundation of India, and Center for Sustainable Agriculture in India. So they administered a survey of 1,500 farmers across 12 states in India, covering 200 districts, to understand the effect of COVID-19 on the farmers. It was dominated by the smallholder. The sample was dominated by the smallholder farmers, and also including landless laborer as well as big farmers. So I would like to present a couple of very quick facts from the data, which was available. So 40% of the farmers of the sample, they experienced a yield loss occurred from a lockdown due to a lack of labor and storage or transportation option. So they basically lost their yield, almost 40% of them. And then 30% of these farmers were unable to harvest their crop because of issues related to lockdown. This could be either due to lack of labor or due to the heavy expense. The labor become expensive, and as a result, they could not cover their harvesting costs. So they decided not to harvest because the costs were much more than they could have gotten from the market. Since most of the markets were not active, so they didn't take the risk. So essentially 30% of them, the farmers said that they are unable to harvest their crop. And then among those who could harvest their crop, 22% basically had to store their crop due to lockdown related issues. And overall, it forced 55% of the farmers to store their crops since they are unable to sell the product. So it's a huge amount of shock that is being borne by the farmer at that particular time as a kind of immediate effect on the shock. And just to note a number from the survey, in West Bengal, only 19% of the 81% farmers who harvested vegetables during this particular period were able to sell the product. So basically it shows those who are even, basically harvesting vegetables in West Bengal, only less than 20% of them were able to sell the product. So it means for the rest 80%, those who harvested the vegetables, they were unable to sell the product in the market. So it actually shows that they absorbed a huge part of the shock in terms of their income because they are unable to sell it in the market. And then there are already some short-term to medium-term effects. Even though there has been significant, I think the weather is pretty good for now, and the prediction in terms of the monsoons is good. However, it is important to remember that on the onset of the Kharif season, due to the issues of the requirement of timely availability of seeds and others, some farmers mentioned that their capability to sow compared to the last year has been negatively affected, and it is pretty easy or clear to understand why. During the lockdown period, there was no dealer who can offer the seeds and other stuff. There was no labor available, so cultivation activities for some of the crops were negatively adversely affected. And given that farming is kind of seasonal, there has been some impact in delaying their sowing season, which will definitely impact their output in the future. Leading to some potential, loss of their future outputs. And then on the top of that, as Dr. Sindhara was mentioning, in terms of expanding the access to credit, there is a huge kind of like cut down of financing by the banks and the microfinance institutions because everybody become panicky. And as a result of that, even if small farmers required some finance for their sowing season, none of the banks, microfinance institutions, or other non-banking institutions were ready to offer the loan, which they would have otherwise done in the previous years. So as a result of that, it significantly limited their ability to borrow from the market. So they had to scale down their activities, and that actually indicates that they are losing future farm revenues as a result of lack of access to required finance. So during the short and medium term, even though the prediction for weather is good in terms of in monsoon, it is good, but we do expect to see a fall in their output for some of the farmers who have been negatively affected during the lockdown period in terms of delaying their sowing season, as well as delayed access to inputs, as well as delayed access to loans. Now next, I would like to quickly touch base on some of the transmission mechanisms, because it is important to understand, given that some of the findings that we discussed, that they have been severely affected because of the lockdown, like other sectors as well. What are the channels through which this shock actually transmits? And for that, I think it is very important to understand, which is quite, very clear to all of us, that specifically the agriculture in India, as well as the farmers, smallholder farmers, they suffer from poor infrastructure. And one of the major issues out of many is the access to warehouse or cold storage. So in terms of the infrastructure gap, there is a huge gap of warehouse and cold storage access. And that had made things worse, because in an ideal situation, even if there is a demand shock, if there is appropriate storage mechanism available, the farmers would have been able to store it for the time being, and then they would have been able to avoid some of the losses that they incurred because of the perishable products they were unable to sell. And in terms of the other infrastructure factor in the supply chain of the entire agricultural value chain, the transportation facility is a very important factor, right? Because the transportation facility actually has been, it is very poor in India in general. And most of the farmers, smallholders specifically, kind of like depend on their own transportation and informal kind of transportation. And as a result, as soon as there is lockdown, all these facilities have been stopped. So the farmers did not have proper access to transport their product as well. So even if they were able to sell the product, there was no transportation available. So in terms of infrastructure, these two sections, I think, for the future, perspective, understanding the requirement of expanding the capacity of warehouses and cold storages, specifically for the perishable ones, is important. And also to establish the transportation facility in a proper way, having more formal transport than the informal transport sector is also something important to understand. And the second and more important part is the dependence of the smallholder farmers on the informal value chain and actors. And we know that the entire agricultural value chain is predominantly managed by the informal actors like traders, procurement agents, input suppliers. Most of them act as a middleman, and the middlemen control the market. And there are multiple layers in multiple types of middlemen working in multiple layers. Someone work in the procurement agent, some work as a trader, some work in the mandis, and then from mandis to the vendors, so on and so forth. So given the multiple layers of predominance of middlemen, if one or two of the pillars break down because of the pandemic or some forced restrictions in terms of movement and other stuff, immediately the whole system collapses. So that's why they are so dependent. The smallholder farmers are so dependent on the middlemen, and the middlemen are typically they are prone to exit the market quite easily. So if the mandis are not operating, for example, the trader will not come, or the procurement agent will not come to the farmers. They will not, either they will not come, or they will offer something which is highly exploitative to the farmers. In some cases, some of the farmers mentioned that the prices offered to them was pretty low. So it did not make any sense for them to sell the product because their harvesting cost would have been much higher than that. And so overall, basically, the dependence on this middleman made things worse. And if there were formal channels, it could have been probably less severe on the farmers. Now, I would like to spend another 5-10 minutes in understanding the what mitigation strategies could have been adopted to avoid some future risks. We cannot say that there will be no such future events. I mean, definitely, given the integration with the global economy, given the way we see other shocks, there will be future pandemic like this. Now we need to think through and figure out, given this experience, is there something that we can do in order to prepare, make the smallholders more resilient to such shocks? And one of the major, I think, the channels, as we discussed, is the predominance of the informal linkage. And these informal linkages are highly susceptible to this type of, pandemics. So if we are able to reduce their dependence on informal linkages, probably we'll be able to avoid some of the losses or major portion of the losses. Because even if there is increase, even if there are lack of demand because of the pandemic, people need to eat, right? So there has to be a requirement for the food, mostly the food product that the farmers are producing directly. So we expect that the demand, there will be some shock in the demand, but we don't expect that this is going to shrink a lot. So essentially, if we are able to link up the farmers properly, then hopefully that will not be so disastrous like this time. And as we discussed, given the farmers are mostly dependent on the middlemen, we need to think through and figure out how to formalize the market structure. And one of the ways that the farmers can be structured into a formal arrangement is through formation of farmer producer organizations, which is the kind of the cooperatives, agricultural cooperatives, we can say. And the farmer producer organizations typically act as an aggregator on behalf of the participating farmers. And it is much easier to link the farmer producer organizations to the formal market compared to individual farmers. Unfortunately, the current situation in India, we are still way behind what we could do in terms of formalizing the smallholders. We have only 6,000 farmer producer organizations in India with around, let's say, 1,000 members per FPO. And 80% of them are the smallholders. So one of the aspects that we need to think of for mitigation of the future is in terms of organizing these farmers in a formal sector is basically organizing them through the farmer producer organizations. And the government of India has recently set a target of increasing the farmer producer organizations from 6,000 to 10,000 FPOs by 2024. So hopefully that will expand the scope a little bit and formalize the market. But we need much more than that because we have 600,000 villages in India, and 10,000 FPOs is really, really insignificant to organize the farmers under only for the 600,000 villages. So we need to go beyond that. Now, if the FPOs are connected, the farmer producer organizations are connected with the supply chain, then the farmers can actually sell anything to any place. And towards that, there has been some initiatives over the last couple of years to make them less dependent on the mandis and more focused on the online trading platform. So there has been initiatives to open up such platforms. And in a recent policy note, the finance minister has again vouched for that in terms of expanding the e-marketing of agricultural product. Previously, some portion of that was prohibited because it was supposed to be the farm products were supposed to be sold through the agricultural primary market committees. Now this has been abolished. So hopefully that is the way to move forward. And in addition to that, once the farmers are organized under the APOs, there is a big role of contract farming, because most of the cases, the uncertainty in terms of the demand is affecting the farmers. However, there are successful cases around the world where contract farming has played a very important role in reducing the risk of the farmers, specifically giving them access to guaranteed market. So if we are able to implement contract farming through the farmer producer organizations, then most of the smallholder farmers, production will be guaranteed for off-taking by the contract farmers, by the contract. And as a result of that, even if there is a lack of demand in the market, or even if there is a transportation issue, the providers of the contract, it would be their responsibility. For example, some of the companies that offer the contract farming, it would be their responsibility to collect the product given the contract existing. And the smallholder farmers will not need to be worried about selling their product in the market, because this is already guaranteed through that. So I think moving forward, organization of the farmers within the farmer producer organizations, and again, increasing the extent of contract farming through new institutions, that will play a vital role in reducing the risk faced by the smallholders for certain types of shocks like this. And on the infrastructure side, I think in terms of the mitigation strategies, it is very important that we understand the requirement for storage, improving our storage capacities in warehouses, both for pulses and for perishables, because anytime there is a lack of demand, it can be properly managed through the storage facilities. So we don't end up having a lot of wastage, as we have seen during this COVID period, specifically during mid-March to almost beginning or mid of May, when there was lack of transportation facilities available, no mandis were operating, and at the same time there was lack of the drivers to transport the products. So if we have access to improved storage, then in many cases some of the perishable stuff will anyways cannot be, we cannot avoid the loss, but some of the other products can be stored in the warehouses, and that will also improve the farmers producer organizations' capacity to trade with any part of the country, through the e-trade platforms. And in recent policy reforms, I think the government of India, the finance minister has announced removal of agricultural primary market committees, the requirement of selling through the APMCs, agricultural primary market committees, to the mandis. And basically they are promoting the electronic national agricultural market, although it is it is very big, in the initial stage, there is not much acceptance of the electronic national agricultural market. We need a lot of time and a lot of iterations in the process. However, it is probably going in the right direction if there is policy orientation in terms of expanding the scope of electronic national agricultural market, and then acceptance from different large-scale buyers. Probably these things will be the dependence on the mandis and dependence on the informal channels can be minimized. And towards that, as Professor Sinharoy mentioned, in terms of the agricultural policy after the COVID, the government of India has allocated, the finance minister has mentioned that the government has allocated 1 lakh crore for improving the farm gate procurement and farm gate infrastructure policies. So most of the instances, I think these particular measures will help to formalize the market structure for the smallholders in the agricultural sector. And that in addition to that, from this, in addition to the infrastructure angle, there has to be strengthening of formal agricultural value chain institutions. And specifically, there are 5 different types of institutions that we need to think of. There is one sort of institution known as the core agri-tech or the deep agri-tech companies which provide the weather information, sensors, and other stuff, providing data support to the farmers. Then second set of companies are the agricultural finance providers. For example, different types of microfinance institutions, non-banking institutions that provide access to credit and other products to the farmers. The third institutions are the input linkage providers. So there are different types of input linkage companies which are linking the farmers with the input providers and trying to provide lower cost input to the farmers and with a formal channel. So even if there are problems in terms of the pandemic and other stuff, still this channel will be active. And then the other part is the market linkage for the farmers. And one example is the Ninja Cart, as many of us know that they collect product from the farmers, and then Big Basket as well. However, both of these institutions are suffering from lack of warehousing capacities, which falls under the infrastructure development. Because even if they are linking the farmers, if there is not properly managed warehouse, the supply chain management will not be very efficient. And as a result, their expected outreach could be much more if there is enough supply, the warehouse management as well as, supply chain activities done. And finally, another type of institution which provides the multiple solutions. There are some institutions that provides the farmers a wholesome approach. For example, they link the farmers or the farmer producer organizations with the core agrotech, with the agri-finance companies, with the input linkage providers and market linkage providers. So technically, these providers of multiple solutions, they act as an aggregator, and then they connect the farmers with all different types of legs of support they need. And I think there are few institutions in the current space, but there is a need for strengthening and developing more such institutions to reach out to so many farmers, more than 150 million smallholders through the farmer producer organizations. So technically, we need to build up and strengthen the new linkage institutions, the formal linkage institutions, and moving, so that we can actually reduce the dependence of the sector on the informal institutions. Finally, I'd like to just summarize very quickly the way forward as we have discussed. The strategy for preventing such losses in the future, given these type of incidences will happen in future, there has to be a strategy of combination of different activities. For example, there has to be improvement in infrastructure, improvement or increase in the formal value chain actors in the agriculture space, improvement in the online marketing activities, and also proper supply chain has to be arranged in the agricultural market. All these take a long time, but unless we start different components, start acting on the different components, we'll never reach there. So the most important steps would be improving the infrastructure and the linkages for the smallholders with the formal, institutions like value chain and supply chain actors. And a direct advantage of that would be, in addition to what we are thinking right now, but a direct advantage will be it is going to improve their yields. More and more formal institutions are helping the farmers. They reduce their risk, weather related and other, and provide them improved access to finance and access to capital. And finally, with more formal institutions, the farmers can be linked directly to the market, more easily. So they get better access to finance, better access to market as well. So in all account, that these activities, specifically improving infrastructure and increasing the outreach of formal institutions in the agricultural value chain space, will improve their livelihoods. And in this way also, we will be better prepared to deal with some situations like this, because if there are more formal institutions in the space, then it would be easy to maintain the access to the farm products. And if we have mostly the formal institutions, the government can assign them as the necessary service providers. So, which is very difficult to do, for the large number of informal providers. If we have the formal providers, companies providing this access to market, then technically it is much easy to ensure that the staff of the company is well trained to manage this situation. For example, using proper protective equipment while they are carrying the product from the farmers to the market and from the market to the consumers. Then it will lead to better access to storage and management facilities, more procurement, and technically it will require less travel for the farmers because the travel requirement will be taken care by these institutions. The farmers will just sell the product to them, and then they will take from the farm gate to the mandis or even to the end consumers. And then the formal delivery system with the farm gate and market to home, farm gate to market and market to home will also ensure that these type of activities can be traced very clearly. If there are given number of institutions which are doing this, even if let's say 100, 200 such institutions, it would be easy to manage these institutions to maintain proper safety during this pandemics because we need the food supply. And from that particular perspective, if we are able to employ these techniques, the protective techniques through the formal channels, it is much easier to implement that and secure secure the health. In some instances, as you have seen previously in many areas, for example, in Chennai, in other places, the mandis led to a huge amount of transmission of COVID-19. And because number one, there are a lot of informal agents who are not following the procedure properly. So if we are able to reduce these mandis and depend more on the formal channels, like the supply chain actors, and formalize the entire system where the employees will know exactly what is expected, they can be monitored very well, and we could probably avoid the spread of such disease which we have experienced here in this instance because we are not well prepared. So the whole monitoring and tracking of proper safety measures through the formal institutions will be much easier. And that will benefit not only the farmers, not only the employees who are working, but also the end consumers because of the lack of, it will break the transmission channels. I think that I would like to stop here. Given that we don't have time, I would open the floor for discussion and questions. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Dr. Shantanu Sadhu, for a very informative and insightful lecture. We enrich a lot from Dr. Sadhu's discussion. Without awaiting any further, let's enter into the interactive session. Now, I'd request Dr. Bipul De, Associate Professor and Head of Department of Economics, Netaji Nagar College for Women, to start the question-answer session. Over to Dr. Bipul De. Sir, please.
Thank you. Good evening and warm greetings to everyone. It's a great privilege for me to share the screen with our distinguished speakers. Thank you, Professor Sinaroy, for an enlightening presentation. We appreciate having these areas now clarified. Thank you, Sir, Dr. Sadhu, for your nice and comprehensive presentation. There would be hardly any better person than you because you have done extensive work in this area. So we can move to the question and answer session. For the participants, we just want to share one information. We are going to start the question and answer session, and for further clarification, you can mail us, you can WhatsApp us, we'll forward your queries to our esteemed speakers. Sir, both of you, please allow me to start the question and answer session.
Please do.
Thank you, sir. And for the smooth functioning, I am just turning off my video. Okay. The first question actually pertains to Shoykot, sir. Actually, a lot of questions here for Shoykot, sir. And I think it is not possible to cater all the questions. We are just taking a very few. most of the questions actually related to the cash transfers, MSME, and the demand and supply shock. Few questions related to GST. I just want to start with the first question. This is from Bordita. Sir,
Yes.
due to this pandemic, it affects people psychologically as well as financially, especially to the vulnerable section of our society. To what extent are you seeing remote options as possibilities for sustaining livelihoods in the informal sector? For which kinds of work do you find feasible remote options? Sir, for God's sake.
See, in the informal sector, to me, there are very few options for remote options for livelihood as of now. The first constraint to go for remote options at this point is to have a skilled workforce. The workforce that we have in the informal sector, they might have the skill to do their specific job in the factory shed or in their field, but to do it remotely, you need digital literacy, and digital literacy is not viable for these people for two reasons. They may not be skilled enough to imbibe digital technology, one, and the other thing, the connection is the other issue, because there is no stable connectivity whatsoever we say about the connectivity situation in the country. Now, why I say bring this connectivity issue up is for the following reason: is actually it is easier to do an email or be in the social media than to work digitally with the factory owner or with other co-workers in a factory shed. So unless these supply side things are taken care of all through the country at a very cheaper price, remote working for the workers is not a viable option at the moment, especially for the informal sector, especially for the unorganized workers.
Okay, sir. Thank you, sir. The next question goes like this. What type of immediate and medium to long measures can be taken to minimize adverse economic impact of the pandemic on the corporate sector?
See, the thing that the option that the government has taken through credit disbursement or to infuse capital with the banks to the non-banking financial companies, the microfinance institutions, through mutual funds, that eases credit flow, which is often a problem if the banks may not be willing to give their surplus fund. So the government has ensured easy credit flow to the banks, which can do, but that is not enough. If you have to instill confidence in the first thing for the private corporate sector to start operating is to regeneration of demand. For me, in the immediate run, apart from credit flow, easy credit flow to the corporate sector, especially to the micro, small, and medium enterprises, which is a large part of our economy, and to the large sector as well, because many of these micro, small, medium enterprises are connected to the large sector. So, and they work as satellites to the large sector. So it is important that credit flow are there, but there has to be a rejuvenation of demand. And this demand, unless there is demand, the private sector will not start production. they will not have enough demand for their products. Now, this will instill confidence in the private sector. Mere reforms, which is needed. I don't deny that reforms at all stages are needed as the economy has progressed, but during a period of crisis, the government has to do the hand-holding, otherwise the private sector, the private sector will not come forward. So private expenditure, private investment is only comes only when the government steps in and does and for us to see now, even if they have committed 10% of GDP, if you actually see, large part of it is through credit flows and not through mere cash transfers, where you have as I said, rising specter of unemployment, rising specter of poverty, inequality in the economy. And it is here that the demand in the economy gets constrained. Demand, and if you have to start supply back, once the easing of process starts, the supply will resume, but the supply will not resume at its optimum unless there is concomitant demand in the economy for production. So to me, in the short run, it is essentially, in the very short run, it is essentially a demand management thing. Demand has to be restored and then with ease of supply in the economy, things would move on in the short run to the medium term, and reforms will only work. Easing through reforms will only work if we want to sustain the growth process over the medium term and the long term.
Thank you, sir. Thank you again. Actually, your third question to you actually related to your last answer. Sir, question goes like this. Government has announced several measures to make fund available to the MSMEs under the Atmanirbhar Bharat package. The banks are reluctant to lend to the small startups and SMEs. Sluggish demand and unavailability of workers have proved to be a two-edged sword, bringing the survival of the SMEs at stake. So how do the SMEs can bounce back in this situation?
Very, very nice question.
Very nice question, actually.
When I spoke in the earlier, I had mentioned about this, that there is not enough credit disbursal to the MSME sector. Even if the government has flushed with funds, there are new reforms in that package that it will be done in a very short period of time. No collaterals are needed. Despite that, I can talk to you with confidence that there are several economic recovery committees in the states of Kerala, Tamil Nadu, and many private agencies who are doing surveys, and it is shown from all the surveys, I know about all the surveys, and it is shown that credit offtake by the MSMEs from these banks and non-banking financial companies is merely 10 to 13% of the companies have taken. So large part, 85 to 90% of the companies have not gone in for credit in most of the states. Now, if these MSMEs have to start back, I had said in the beginning that the government through cash transfer especially to the small and medium, has to cover up for the fixed cost, which is already leading to losses for the MSMEs, and also cover up for the wage payments that these MSMEs are likely to take. So this is one thing. And then in this specter of growing unemployment with migrant workers shifting back, getting labor and raw material will be the biggest challenge. But unless demand resumes and part of the losses are covered up in the economy, production for the MSMEs will be a distant reality, even if you allow more and more credit flows to the MSME sector.
Thank you, sir. Sir, question number 4 for you, and then we'll shift to Dr. Shantashadi. Okay, sir? This is for you.
Thank you.
This is for you. If construction of industrial output be attributed mostly to basic metals, petroleum products, chemicals, motor vehicles, and machinery production, then what kind of measures can be taken for their revival?
I know who made this question. I read the plethora of questions. Actually, turning back these industries is not easy. It's important that most of these industries, and most of them are in the large scale sector with small scale components, small and medium scale components. These industries, on the one hand, they need reforms. These industries would require easy flow of raw materials and inputs. Now, with the new kind of problem that we are into, actually, one more sector which actually demands attention is pharmaceuticals. Most of the raw materials and inputs to most pharmaceutical industries in India, actually the raw materials come from China. And if you block Chinese imports into the economy right at this moment, you can allow investments into these sectors for providing raw materials. But by the turn, they churn their output out, providing inputs to these sectors. They would take time. So there is every possibility that the industrial decline that we see today prior to the pandemic, that is likely to continue. And there is another problem. The other problem is the cash starvation problem of these industries, because most of these industries, there is a delay in getting the GST refunds unless the supply side things are noted. So one is the raw materials, the other is capital goods, the third is actually technology improvement, because these are all technology intensive sectors. And now the new technology in the post-pandemic situation, which is going to come into the economy, the spread of artificial intelligence, if these start coming, so adapting to the new technology, all this will take time. So unless there is enough support both from the private government, and there is concomitant investment by the private sector to take care of this, the industrial sector will not resume so soon. That's my hunch.
Thank you, sir. Sir, you just take a rest. We'll shift to Dr. Shadu. Sir, are you ready, Dr. Shadu? Sir? Dr.
Yes, I'm ready,
Shadu?
Yeah.
Okay, thank you, sir. Sir, first one is this. Does crop insurance policy be an encouragement to the farmers? Any comment on this, sir?
Yes, that is one of the major roles that I think major propositions been made over the last couple of years. I would say over the last 10 years, there have been huge, I mean, a lot of discussion in improving the outreach of crop insurance, because a lot of loss happens because of these, weather related and other issues. And the farmers get indebted because of that. But unfortunately, there are not many good products in the market. So there has been new institutions coming up in the space where they are offering, I think, innovative products. So, but we have a long way to go. But that is one of the indispensable part for protecting the farmers from any type of calamities, not only like the COVID, but any type of natural calamities that is very common in the Indian, scenario.
Thank you, sir. Thank you, sir. Second question actually very much related to your answer. Question goes like this. Don't you think that in absence of organized farming sector, MNCs will take their position and there will be a concentration of power in the farming sector as it is now concentrated in the hands of large farmers. Sir.
I think one of the, there have been a lot of debates in even 80s and 90s, right? When the multinational corporations were entering, like, Lay's and others were entering the agri sector. And I guess, unfortunately, the debates were misplaced because, yes, these multinational organizations have their own powers and they act on their interest. But at the same time, they will help to improve the supply chain overall. So if we are able to reduce, if we need to reduce the dependence on too many informal players, some of them are maybe pretty powerful, the individuals and so on, definitely we need to depend on the formal institutions. And multinational corporations are one part of that, but to my experience, based on my experience, I believe that there have to be a role of newer type of institutions. There are a lot of startups. For example, over the last couple of years, there have been 400 new startups in the agri-value chain space who are trying to provide that solution either in terms of technology or in terms of connecting them with the market or in terms of providing them linkage with the with organized buyers, not only the retail market, but also organized buyers. So there have been many activities through which these different forms of institutions can play a role, not only the multinational corporations, but domestic corporations, domestic institutions like small industries can actually play a role. I mean, I wouldn't say industries, but institutions. So I think without that, that approach where we are expanding the newer institutions and trying to make it as formal as possible, different sectors of agri-value chain, we will not be able to achieve the target of, reducing removing the shocks or helping them to cope up with the shocks.
Thank you, sir. Thank you. Okay, so, since we have a time constraint, we'll now stop now. Okay, sir, that brings the end of the question and answer session. I think the session has been very, very informative, enriching, and insightful. So, dear friends, this was for day one. A feedback link will be shared tomorrow on 29th in the QA chat box at the end of the session and also through your mail and WhatsApp group. So for the day one, I express my heartfelt gratitude towards eminent speakers, Dr. Shoikat Sinha Roy and Dr. Shanto Sadhu, for being with us in spite of their busy schedule. Thank you, sir. Thank you again. Thanks to all the participants.
Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Thanks to all the participants for their Thanks to all the participants for their overwhelming response and active participation today. I hope your experience is satisfying. Sincere gratitude to our two principals, Dr. Tapan Kumar Ghosh and Dr. Ram Swarup Gangopadhyay, for their guidance and continuous support. I have to acknowledge the support and cooperation of Dr. Tushar Kanti Ghora, Administrator of Netaji Nagar College for Women, and the governing body of Vidyasagar Metropolitan College. I thank the coordinated effort of all the faculties of Department of Economics of both the colleges who made this international webinar reality. A very special and heartfelt thanks to the members of the organizing committee. I express my respect and love to all my colleagues, teaching as well as non-teaching staff from both the colleges for being with us all through the webinar. And before we say goodbye, a gentle reminder to all of you. The day two tomorrow will start at 4 p.m. Stay safe and good night. Namaskar.
Thank you, sir.